What we need in the West, in these institutions, in our public life, is a Berlin Wall moment whereby it suddenly dawns on people that actually the emperor has no clothes. The people enforcing these woke speech codes are a tiny minority. And we just have to stand up and say, we're not going to take it anymore. We're not going to do your bidding. We're going to say what we think. Acknowledge that they're anti-free speech. Sometimes they'll say that they do care about free speech, but they need to silence people like you and me in order to create room for marginalized people.
What is the link between woke culture and free speech?
That's the rationale for taking away our liberties. It's a kind of extreme form of safetyism. Now they're enjoying power, then it's no longer in their interest to defend free speech. On the contrary, it's in their interest to suppress the free speech of their opponents, because their opponents are wanting to challenge their power.
Welcome to the Quick Thought on That podcast. My name is Þórarinn, and today I'm joined with Toby Young. Toby, thank you so much for coming.
No problem.
Toby is a journalist, the founder and the director of Free Speech Union, and an associate editor at The Spectator. He founded the Daily Skeptic, a news website that challenges the agency of moral, political, and cultural discourse. Is there anything that you would like to add to this list? How long have you been a journalist now?
Well, I think I published my first piece in a national magazine in 1985, so longer than I care to remember. So 38 years.
Quite a long time. And you came to the spotlight globally for being banned on various platforms. Now, just to give our listeners a picture of what that entailed, can you summarize how that transpired and how it affected your career as a journalist?
Yes, I was I was notified in mid-September by PayPal that they were closing all three of my PayPal accounts. So my personal account, the account of the Daily Skeptic, and the account of the Free Speech Union. And in the case of my personal account, that wasn't a huge loss because I didn't use it very often. Though they did say they were going to retain, I think it was like all the money in the account. I couldn't get anything out. But there wasn't much in there. But the Daily Skeptic, that was a blow because about a quarter of our recurring donations from readers were being made via PayPal. And it was even more serious in the case of the Free Speech Union because about a third of our recurring membership dues were being paid via PayPal. So that was about a third of our income placed in jeopardy. And so that was an existential risk. I got in touch with PayPal to try and find out why they'd closed my accounts. The only in the notification I received from them, all it said was that I'd breached their acceptable use policy in all three cases without specifying exactly how. And I couldn't get any sense out of them. I couldn't. They wouldn't provide any explanation as to why they'd done this. They hadn't given me any notice. There didn't seem to be any right of appeal. And so I went public and complained about it in the media, on TV, in newspapers, and someone from PayPal told the Times of London that the reason they'd closed all three accounts is because I was engaged in promoting misinformation about the COVID-19 vaccines, which was odd because you could sort of conceivably make that argument with respect to the Daily Skeptic, but not the Free Speech Union or my own personal account. And in any event, it's not true of the Daily Skeptic, but some people say that if you publish any content challenging the efficacy or safety of the mRNA COVID-19 vaccines, that you are trafficking in misinformation, even though all you're doing is referring to peer-reviewed studies. So that it may be that was a factor. And they later told another journalist it was because I breached their policy on hate speech, but I couldn't think what that could possibly be. Maybe that was because the Free Speech Union has defended some gender-critical feminists from trans rights activists, and maybe PayPal was taking the trans rights activist line that if you say a trans woman isn't a woman, then that's hate speech. So if you defend someone who gets into trouble for saying that, then you're defending hate speech, which is sort of like being guilty of hate speech. No, they didn't seem to have worked out exactly why they'd banned me, and they kept coming up with different reasons. And I'm along with another group called Us for Them, who'd also had their PayPal account closed. They were a group who campaigned to get schools to reopen during the lockdown here in the UK, and they closed their account, no notice. Same thing, breached our acceptable use policy. Didn't explain how, and the two of us approached some friendly peers and MPs in the House of Lords and the House of Commons over here. And we managed to get 42 peers and MPs to write a letter to the then business secretary, Jacob Rees-Mogg, saying, will you ask PayPal why it's closed our accounts? Because they won't tell us. And this seems like a pernicious and sinister form of cancel culture. It must be because they just disapprove of our politics. And why is this California-based corporation interfering in public debates in the UK in this way? Nothing we've done or said is unlawful. We haven't committed fraud, etc. And Jacob Rees-Mogg took it seriously, and he gave an interview to the Telegraph in which he did describe it as a form of cancel culture. And the next day, PayPal restored all my accounts and apologized to me for any inconvenience the closure had caused. But that doesn't draw a line under the affair as far as I'm concerned. Since then, the Free Speech Union has been lobbying Parliament, lobbying the government to change the law so it becomes illegal to withhold or withdraw service from a customer if you're a big payment processor like PayPal, but just because you disapprove of their politics, and that's the only reason. And we're making some headway. We're not quite there yet, but I think we're making some progress. And I think we need a law like that to stop financial services companies like PayPal debanking people because they disapprove of their political views. We need a law like that to stop the emergence of a Chinese-style social credit system in the West, whereby if you say something that the authorities disapprove of, or even the board of a woke corporation disapproves of, you lose access to financial services, which is a very extreme form of cancel culture, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a quite an interesting times. I mean, and especially for like smaller content makers that pretty much can't get 42 MPs in any country to sign a letter, and you probably have a lot more people that have been banned but do not have the resources to uh, fight it. And I was wondering, where does this ban stand today? Because I mean, it's obviously pointed at you personally because it was your personal account as well as the other accounts. Where does this ban stand? I can still find your content on YouTube. PayPal had to revoke their ban. If I'm not mistaken, you're still banned on Facebook. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Facebook have banned. I have two personal accounts on Facebook, and the Daily Skeptic has an account, and all three are currently suspended by Facebook. They were restored about 48 hours ago, and then banned again about 24 hours ago. And the crime, as far as Facebook is concerned, is again promoting misinformation about the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines. And as I say, that what they mean by that is just uh, referring to any evidence, however well sourced, that the vaccines aren't as effective or as safe as they were originally sold to us as being. For some reason, that's no longer taboo on Twitter, and Facebook, I think, is reviewing its anti COVID vaccine misinformation and disinformation policies. And they had a public consultation about whether to keep those policies in place now that the pandemic was over, or at least at that point it had been declared over. I think they may have that might have been reconsidered. But and I submitted something to the public consultation, setting out the argument as to why it should be possible to debate um, things like the efficacy and safety of the vaccines in the public square, and people expressing dissenting or skeptical points of view should not have their accounts suspended, particularly when they're not actually trafficking in misinformation or disinformation, just referring to peer reviewed studies in respectable scientific journals, which is all we ever do on the Daily Skeptic. And they didn't respond to that submission. They just banned me again a few days later. Who knows if Facebook is going to change its policy, but I've now almost given up on Facebook. It's very difficult to appeal these decisions, just as it is in the case of PayPal. I mean, I think it was possible to get the political support that Us for Them and I managed to get our accounts restored by PayPal because it was such an extreme form of cancel culture, and I think probably a breach of the British financial regulations. The fact that they gave us no notice is a breach of the regulations. So it seemed very egregious and an extreme case. Whereas Facebook just deciding to suspend my accounts, I think it would be difficult to generate much political support to oppose that. I might appeal to the the Meta oversight board. I haven't got around to it yet. It's a pain in the bum, and Facebook's kind of it's not really an important distribution channel for the Daily Skeptic, not like Twitter. Twitter's very important, so I probably won't bother to try and get my accounts restored. I'll just forget about it.
Yeah, I agree with your assessment about Facebook. I interviewed Martin Kulldorff at the height of the pandemic, and in the aftermath, it just became unbearable to distribute any content, and all of the advertisement I had been purchasing before that became a lot more expensive, and it got weird features. All of the content just went to 65-year-olds and older, and they just skewed everything against my distribution. So I completely agree with you on Facebook. It's probably a platform that is not worth saving at this point.
Yeah,
I was gonna get Yeah, go
sorry,
on.
yeah, go on. Oh, I was just going to say, uh, the Twitter files revealed the extent of the pressure that was applied to Twitter at the height of the pandemic to suppress any dissenting information, such as tweets by Martin Kulldorff and Jay Bhattacharya, anything praising the Great Barrington Declaration and so forth. And I imagine that Facebook has been under very much the same kind of pressure. And at some point, perhaps that'll be disclosed in the way the Twitter files have disclosed what went on at Twitter. But um, uh, what was disappointing about one of the very disappointing things about the Twitter files was the revelation that um, Twitter executives, senior Twitter executives, weren't being threatened with fines, let alone imprisonment, if they failed to remove content that challenged the pandemic narrative, the vaccine narrative. They were just told that that was the responsible thing to do, and they did it. They did the bidding of the FBI and various lobbyists and members of the boards of pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, without being threatened with anything. They were just persuaded to do it, and I imagine the same is true of Facebook. And I think the reason they're so willing to do the bidding of these various authorities is because they think it's a way of staving off regulation. But in the case of the UK, it hasn't really worked because we've got this bill called the Online Safety Bill, which is going to regulate big social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, and that looks as though it'll become law later this year. But it's hard to understand why platforms like Twitter, as it was, and Facebook are willing to engage in censorship at the bidding of various public health authorities and security agencies. Um, uh, you know, um, Particularly as they think of themselves as part of the media, and one of the things they do is journalism. It's shocking, really, and I think that the extent of that kind of suppression probably extends to the mainstream media too.
Mhm.
I'm sure that newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post also came under a fair amount of pressure from the same groups of people to suppress anything dissenting about the pandemic and vaccine narratives, just as they do anything about the climate change narrative as well. Yeah, journalism is not what it was.
No, it's quite an interesting. I hadn't thought about. I mean, they've created somewhat of a interesting circumstances for themselves. They want to be journalists when it suits them. They say that they're a platform when it suits them, and I hadn't thought about this this variable of trying to stave off regulations. Because I mean, here in Iceland, it's been, I think it's at Parliament today that they're thinking about putting somewhat of a 15% minimum tax on the revenues of big tech companies that sell all sorts of stuff here in Iceland. So yes, perhaps they were just given into the demands based on like, you're a good person if you really, if you don't do this, you're pretty much a bad person. If you do this, you're a good person. And at the exchange of, well, we'll keep the regulations off for a few more years. Do
Mm.
you think that, back to the pandemic, do you think that free speech faces a different reality at the aftermath of the pandemic? Do you think it changed the trenches that we're fighting in?
Yeah. Well, I think it accelerated a trend which was already in place, which I think the for want of a better word, the global elite, the educated global elite, the kind of people that are meeting in Davos right now, um, decided in the aftermath of the populist revolts in 2016, the election of Donald Trump in the US, and the decision of the British public to vote to leave the European Union. They thought we have to do something to stop electorates making these terrible choices. And they thought, why are they making these choices? Why are these electoral contests going the wrong way from our point of view? Why are the outcomes wrong? And they rather than, accept that their values to a great extent are out of kilter with the values of ordinary people, general populations, rather than accept that there's a certain amount of principled resistance to globalism and its undemocratic nature. They just think the only possible explanation is that these people who voted the wrong way were misinformed by bad actors. So we have now to do something about all this misinformation and disinformation and these conspiracy theories, which are prompting people to vote for candidates like Donald Trump. And they believe that that was a contributory factor in the riot that occurred in Washington in January 2021, and probably they think it was a factor in what happened recently in Brazil. There's this kind of there's this kind of elite panic, this fear that the mob is going to revolt, and they believe that a big factor in what they see as the kind of uh, corruption of the democratic process is the spreading of misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy theories on social media. So there is this kind of global movement, quite a coordinated global effort to suppress what they call misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy theories on social media. But often those terms are used just to describe content they disapprove of or facts which are inconvenient rather than false. And I think that kind of machinery of suppression um, uh, was uh, grew significantly during the pandemic. But I don't think it's going to be. It's not going to be wound back. I mean, it looked as though Facebook might wind it back a bit, but I don't think they're going to. And there's no evidence that they have now. Twitter, maybe under Elon Musk, is going to be a little less censorious. Seemingly it is, but who knows how long that's going to last. I'm not sure that Elon Musk will hold on to it forever. Doesn't seem to be making him any money, just losing him money. So I think the kind of general direction of travel is towards less free speech, more suppression of dissent from the narratives that the global elite want to promote. It's hard to know exactly how to fight back against that. What I've been trying to do is, I've created the Daily Skeptic, which is, and one of the reasons was to create a space for people to express dissent from things like, the wisdom of the lockdown policy, the safety and efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccines, policies like net zero designed to curb carbon emissions, and so on and so forth. Dissent about the kind of woke morality that seems to be infecting institutions across the West. And I thought, well, I can do it in this space. I've created this space. I'm the editor in chief. There's no censorship here. Just smart editorial decisions. But if it, there are various mechanisms that make it difficult to make a success of an alt media website like that. However respectable and however careful you are about making your arguments, because Facebook and until recently Twitter can suppress your attempts to promote your content, and it's quite difficult to attract advertising. I've been trying to attract advertising on the site for almost a year now, and getting almost nowhere because there are various ratings agencies, like there's one in particular called NewsGuard, which rate how safe the content is on your site, how safe it is for advertisers to advertise on your site. And NewsGuard, which is part owned by Microsoft, is very aggressive about downgrading sites which publish dissenting content. They attacked the American Institute for Economic Research when it was involved in promoting the Great Barrington Declaration. They've downgraded us. I think we're now rated 35 out of 100 by NewsGuard, which means you just can't get any proper advertising. And NewsGuard also, the next stage in this kind of suppression, having kind of done their best to make it impossible for alt media sites like the Daily Skeptic to support themselves financially. I think the next step will be to get internet browsers like Chrome and Safari to just automatically block sites like the Daily Skeptic. And NewsGuard is moving into that business. So they want to sell their services to web browsers, and I think they already have a relationship with the Microsoft web browser, whereby you just won't be able to access sites like the Daily Skeptic on your browser unless if you have one of the kind of big mainstream browsers. So it's getting
Mhm.
harder and harder to tell the truth.
Yeah. I when I started looking into this, and especially the Daily Skeptic, I was a bit tentative and even hesitant because everything was being like all of the content was being disencouraged on every platform. When I when I didn't go to the website and I just saw the website, somebody linked to something or something along those lines, you saw like, oh, do you really want to open this link, like learn about COVID-19, learn about this, you should really not go onto this website, it's just stupid stuff for stupid people. And to be honest, I bought into it because it was just I was being infiltrated at every source. When I saw it on Facebook, you saw that, oh no, you should really learn about COVID-19 on this website rather than going proceeding onto this website. And it is hard to fight off. I mean, especially when everything is pointing to one direction, you really become hesitant to take on any other narrative. And I mean, it's just so weird that when something like as a historical variable, nothing changed our lives as much as COVID-19 did. And not to be able to explore different perspectives and different ideas regarding this issue just scares the shit out of me, because it just provides us with a new picture of how we are able to absorb information. If everything is just filtered with, well, you should really not trust this particular person, or you should not trust this particular source. It's just a new kind of world. It's not the market of ideas. It's just the market of ideas where in which you are exclusively supposed to take on the accepted narrative.
Yes, and I think it's part of a broader pattern, um, uh, in which our liberty is being eroded across a number of different dimensions. So part of the rationale for suppressing uh, content that challenged the wisdom of the lockdown policy um, was that um, they just took it for granted that the lockdown policy would mitigate the risk of hundreds of thousands of people dying from COVID-19. And therefore, if you challenge the wisdom of that policy, if you questioned whether it would in fact reduce that risk, you were being irresponsible, because some people might read that and be less likely to observe various COVID restrictions, less likely to socially distance, less likely to wear masks, and so forth. And so they thought that the rationale was we are preventing harm by suppressing this dissenting content. But I think you can sort of argue with them by saying, well, you didn't know for sure that the lockdown policy was going to prevent harm. And in all likelihood, the lockdown policy has done more harm than it's prevented. But for them, that's not a particularly persuasive argument. You can point to Sweden and say, look, they didn't lock down in 2020, fewer excess deaths than other European countries that did. That's not a knockdown argument for them, because what they're trying to, the rationale for the lockdown policy is that it mitigates the risk of hundreds of thousands of people dying. They don't think it's probable that hundreds of thousands of people will die if we don't lock down. The argument is it's possible. And it is our responsibility as policymakers to mitigate the risk of this reasonable worst case scenario. And that's the rationale for taking away our liberties. It's a kind of extreme form of safetyism. They're not saying that if we don't take away your liberties, it's probable that people will die. The argument is if we don't take away your liberties, it's possible that people may die. And as responsible policymakers, it's our responsibility to mitigate the risk of that possible reasonable worst case scenario materializing. And the same argument deployed to suppress hate speech as well. So if for instance, if you say that you don't think trans women or if you think that women's rights should be prioritized over trans rights in areas like women's sports, women's prisons, women's refuges, the argument is that that should be suppressed. Your account should be suspended. You should be banned from Facebook, whatever. Not because saying those things will definitely or even probably cause harm to vulnerable transgender people, but because it might. There's a risk. It's possible. So we have a duty to minimize this risk. And that means suppressing hate speech, as they call it. And the same argument is made with climate change. So the argument, I mean, some climate change activists like Greta Thunberg argue that if we don't reach, if we don't immediately stop emitting carbon, the world is going to catch fire and be uninhabitable, within the next 100 years. But no one who knows anything about climate science takes that kind of prediction seriously. And whenever people have made those sorts of predictions in the past, they've always failed to come true. But I think the more serious climate activist will say, okay, if we don't reduce our carbon emissions, in all likelihood, nothing bad will happen. But there's a possibility that if we don't reduce our carbon emissions, the world will become uninhabitable in 100 years' time. That may be a smaller chance, the probability of that may be as low as 1%. But because the outcome is so catastrophic, if it materializes, we have a responsibility to mitigate the risk of that happening by reducing carbon emissions. So it's this kind of extreme safetyism. An over application of the precautionary principle leads to the erosion of our liberties across a range of dimensions, whether it's our energy use, what kind of cars we're able to drive, what taxes we pay, whether we're imprisoned in our homes, whether schools are closed during pandemics, what we're allowed to say about supposedly vulnerable victim groups on social media and in the mainstream media. In all of these areas, the argument for restricting our freedom, for taking away our freedom, is that if you're allowed to carry on like this, it may cause catastrophic harm. We're not saying it's probable, but that's possible. And because we are responsible individuals, as policymakers, we need to do what we can to mitigate that risk. And this is that's there's then a kind of that rationale, that way of thinking, is then amped up because they add something else. They say, if you don't restrict your behavior, if we as responsible policymakers don't impose these restrictions on your behavior, not only is there a risk that your behavior will lead to catastrophic harm, albeit quite a small risk, but nevertheless a plausible risk. But the people harmed will be the most vulnerable. So that's kind of, it's kind of a cocktail of kind of extreme safetyism and kind of uh, woke moral righteousness. It's our duty to lock down general populations, because if we let COVID rip, the groups that are in danger of being harmed are the most vulnerable people in our society. People, black and minority ethnic groups, are more likely to be harmed by COVID-19 than white middle-aged men.
Hmm.
And the same argument is made about climate change too. If this harm materializes, the people that'll be most badly affected are people in the global south, people in low-income countries, and that's a kind of toxic cocktail. It's like a combination of extreme safetyism, supposedly informed by the science, along with this kind of moral mission to protect the most vulnerable. And if you're an educated policymaker working for a public health department in a Western country, that combination, that argument, that ideology is irresistible.
Hmm. But Toby, can't you see that it's so obvious that the science is settled? Who are you to come here on this big platform of and the big platform that you are provided with in the UK? Who are you to tell the scientists what is correct and what is incorrect? Who are you to tell us that, well, we should be skeptical because, well, if there is only 1%, as Warren Buffett said and you mentioned in your speech, if there's only 1%, it is just very important that we take that 1% very seriously. We cannot take that risk of, if that 1% materializes, we ought to. I mean, there's 1% that you get hit by another car when you're driving. You still put on a seatbelt. So what would your response be to that?
Yeah. Um, well, I think uh, the seatbelt analogy doesn't quite work, because what the climate alarmists are asking us to do is to stop driving altogether, not just take precautions which mitigate the risk of being involved in a crash or being harmed by a crash. Um, I think I think we could argue about whether the science of climate change is settled. Um, and is science ever settled? Is it ever right to suppress scientific evidence that seems to contradict the kind of prevailing scientific hypotheses, because you believe those hypotheses to be correct? Well, I don't think it is. That's not kind of keeping faith with science and the scientific method. So I don't think that, even if there is an overwhelming consensus amongst climate scientists, and I think that consensus is often exaggerated, that's not a reason not to raise doubts, not to look at other forms of evidence and so forth. But I don't. In order to make the argument I'm making to you, I don't need to challenge the supposedly settled science of climate change, because even you know even scientists who believe that the average global temperatures over the past 50 years have increased as a result of man-made carbon emissions. Um, the more serious aren't saying that if we don't reduce those emissions, we are definitely facing a catastrophe, or even probably facing a catastrophe. They only say a catastrophe is possible. We think the link has been established sufficiently well, and there's a sufficiently established, the evidence is sufficient to show that there is this small but real risk of catastrophic climate change if we don't adjust our behavior. The Warren Buffett argument, even if there's just and they don't usually say there's, when people talk about species going extinct, if you drill down into the data, the probability of large number of species becoming extinct within the next 100 years or by the end of this century, if we reduce carbon emissions, is actually very small. But they think, nevertheless, it would be irresponsible not to mitigate that risk. What can you say to kind of challenge that kind of reasoning? And it was, as I said in my speech in Iceland, it's very much the reasoning that Pascal came up with for why you should behave as if God exists and the Bible is true. The argument is, okay, the probability of God existing and the Bible being true is quite slim. But if God does exist, if the moral precepts in the Bible are the moral precepts we should live by, then if we don't, we'll go to hell and we'll face eternal damnation. So the probability of the Bible being true and of God existing may be quite low, but the cost of not adjusting our behavior and believing in God and behaving like God-fearing Christians is so high, eternal damnation in the fires of hell, that we should adjust our behavior accordingly. And that's the same argument for why we should, get rid of petrol and diesel-driven cars and reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and pay more for energy bills and so on and so forth. But it wasn't I don't think it's a compelling argument in the case of, Pascal's wager, why we should believe. And I don't think it's a particularly compelling argument here. I think it's hard to know exactly how to challenge it. I mean, one way to challenge it is to say, well, there are lots of other potentially catastrophic risks that we don't safeguard ourselves against, like, shouldn't we be colonizing other planets just in case our planet is invaded by an alien race, alien beings? Shouldn't we be building elaborate defenses against an asteroid strike? Because that is, after all, a risk, albeit a very small risk, but nevertheless a risk. So there's a degree of arbitrariness in what catastrophic risks. I call them, I think one way of referring to them is low probability, high consequence risks. Mm-hmm. And there's a kind of arbitrariness as to which low probability, high consequence risks we are supposed to take precautions against. Why does anyone drive? Why does anyone fly? There is always a possibility you might be killed, but we don't modify our behavior. We don't stop doing those things anyway. But I think the counter argument is the one I referred to earlier, which is, well, in the case of flying and driving, asteroid strikes, alien invasion, the risks, the harm of those risks materializing will be caused either to you individually or to mankind as a whole. Whereas the harms we are engaged in trying to mitigate against will disproportionately affect these vulnerable groups who we have a particular responsibility to protect, these historically marginalized groups, people in the global south, Black and minority ethnic people in the West. That's then the sort of the counter argument. And what can you say in response to that? Well, you can say that the measures you're taking to mitigate these risks are adversely affecting precisely the same vulnerable, historically marginalized groups you're seeking to protect. So in the case of lockdown, that was very clear. The people harmed by the lockdown policy were overwhelmingly more likely to be on low incomes, children, elderly people who weren't able to see their relatives, people dying in care homes who weren't able to receive visits. It was clearly the measures being taken to mitigate the risk of people dying of COVID-19 were disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable members of our society. And ditto with the net zero policy. The people who are most adversely affected by rising energy bills are people on low incomes, elderly people who depend upon being able to heat their homes in the winter in order to stay alive. And actually, if we take the net zero agenda seriously, we need to do something to stop low income and middle income countries from developing, from industrializing, even though preventing them from doing that will cause catastrophic harm in those countries. Um, and that's the sort of rationale for why Western countries like Britain and America, perhaps even Iceland, should pay reparations to low income countries if we're going to persuade them to deindustrialize or to halt development because of the carbon emissions involved in that.
Hmm.
So I think that's one argument you can say. You're taking these extreme measures to try and mitigate the risk of these or low probability but high consequence catastrophes occurring, um, because you're concerned about the impact of those events on the most vulnerable people in our society. But the measures you're taking to prevent those risks materializing are disproportionately harming the most vulnerable members of our society. You can make another argument, which is that in the case of the lockdown, and in the case of climate change, the policymakers are relying on models to spit out these reasonable worst case scenarios. What might happen if we don't take action to mitigate these risks materializing? And those models are notoriously unreliable. It seems it seems it's almost like basing policy on looking at the entrails of slaughtered chickens or gazing into crystal balls. I mean, they're not much more reliable than that. They have the kind of patina, they give the illusion of being scientific, but actually they're just being used as a rationale by these policymakers to put in place policies which they want to put in place anyway. So you can kind of challenge some of the science behind these policies. I mean, one way of challenging it is to say, um, uh, you know, you're taking these measures to mitigate the risk of something happening, even though you acknowledge that the risk of it happening is very small. But it's impossible to test that hypothesis. That's sort of non-falsifiable. You can't point to Sweden and say lower excess deaths in almost every other country in Europe in 2020, in spite of not locking down. That proves that locking down didn't prevent anyone
Yeah.
from dying, because
Mm.
the argument isn't that locking down will probably prevent people from dying, only that it will mitigate the risk, which is quite a small risk of people dying. So it's very hard to know how you could go about falsifying the predictions of these models. If their predictions don't come true, well, that doesn't mean they were wrong, because they weren't saying they would necessarily happen, only that there was a risk they might happen. And if a scientific hypothesis isn't falsifiable, then is it really a scientific hypothesis? So you can attack it on that basis too. But it's hard to know exactly what to do to fight back against this extreme safetyism combined with a kind of fetishistic worship of science and scientists, along with this kind of woke moral righteousness. I mean, it's a kind of toxic cocktail, which is kind of the dominant ideology of the kind of elites, policymakers, senior politicians,
Yeah.
and I think probably the only answer is it has a kind of quasi-religious character. It's clearly playing the same kind of role that Christianity played until recently, and maybe that nationalism played up to a point until recently. And so what we need, I think, is something else, another equally compelling ideology, something quasi-religious in nature too, as an alternative which prizes liberty above safety and allows people to make their own risk assessments and doesn't impose them these ridiculous kind of safety measures on people. I kind of try to sketch it out in my very at the very end of my speech in Iceland, what this kind of new liberty loving religion would look like. But
Yeah.
it's a lot of work to do, I think, to develop it.
Yeah, I wanna shift towards a woke culture, which is related to these two topics because The woke never pass up an opportunity to demand that people change their lives to what they want them to be. So I mean, my listeners know that I am somewhat concerned about. I mean, nobody nowadays argues that this is just some teenagers with purple hair at a university. They obviously see the implications of all of these things. Hence, people are starting to worry. You've spoken a lot about this woke culture and its implications, especially on free speech. What is the link between woke culture and free speech?
Well, um, generally speaking, people who um, are in thrall to this quasi-religious cult um, set very little store by free speech. Um, they think that free speech is not a universal human right, but a privilege enjoyed by already privileged people, and that when you make the case for free speech in the public square, what you're really doing is arguing for the preservation of the status and power of cis het white men. Um, and so they also so that's sort of the general case, the woke case against free speech, and they sort of say that sometimes they won't ever sort of acknowledge that they're anti-free speech. Sometimes they'll say uh, that they do care about free speech, but they need to silence people like you and me in order to create room for marginalized people to contribute to the public conversation. We've been dominating that conversation for too long, and we now need to shut up. And if we're not going to do that voluntary, we need to be forced to shut up to give other voices a chance to be heard. That's the kind of the kind of progressive case against free speech, and they don't acknowledge that it is the case against free speech. It's just limiting the speech of one section of the population, the most privileged, to allow the disadvantaged to speak up. And then there's another argument, which is that free speech is often just uh, the excuse, the cover for mounting attacks on vulnerable people. So allowing someone like me to say trans women aren't women, that's not that kind of free speech isn't worth defending because it's harmful or potentially harmful to trans people. It might prompt them to self-harm or commit suicide, or it might threaten their identity in some kind of mysterious way. So that's the other argument, that you need to limit free speech in order to reduce harm to vulnerable, historically disadvantaged groups. And I guess there's also a degree of kind of Machiavellian kind of politicking at play too. So, the same kinds of groups that now aren't defending free speech on the left were some of the most passionate defenders of free speech until quite recently. So, free speech was, for the most part, a left wing rather than a right wing cause until very recently. And that's because, people on the left were more likely to be targeted by censorship than people on the right. Now that they're enjoying some power and some influence, now that they dominate, institutions like universities and museums and galleries and arts companies, and political parties to a great extent, particularly in places like Canada and Australia and New Zealand. Then now they're enjoying power, then it's no longer in their interest to defend free speech. On the contrary, it's in their interest to suppress the free speech of their opponents because their opponents are wanting to challenge their power. So there's that kind of Machiavellian dimension to it as well, I think.
I made a speech yesterday in front of few people with regards to hate speech, and it occurred to me that it's so interesting that at least they would argue that up until recently they had no voice. All of these marginalized groups had no voice, and now that they do, they all of a sudden have to silence everyone who is not completely in agreement with them. But I just wonder where we are headed with regards to this issue, because if we are not able to raise our voice, people inevitably will rebel. I don't know how that will look like. I am a little bit worried about that. And I just I don't understand why people at the same time they say that they have been silenced for decades, if not thousands of years, but it's justified now that we have the power to silence everyone else.
Yeah, I think there are two arguments you can make to challenge um, that way of thinking. Um, the first is that um, historically, free speech has been much more useful to the marginalized, the oppressed, than it has been to privileged people, people in power. So, the uh, without free speech, the suffragettes wouldn't have been able to secure votes for women at the beginning of the 20th century in the UK. Without various landmark victories won by the American Civil Liberties Union in the 1960s, in the Supreme Court, defending the right of civil rights protesters to march, organize, protest, um, then the civil rights movement might not have been as successful as it was. Ditto the gay rights movement and even the trans rights movement. All of these um, uh, political movements which are standing up for the rights of marginalized, disadvantaged peoples depend on free speech to succeed. So it's rather naive, I think, historically naive, of social justice warriors to claim that free speech is of no value to historically marginalized people. It only ever favors the rich, the powerful, the privileged. So historically, that's just ignorant. But secondly, I think you can say, and this was an argument made by Ira Glasser, who was the head of the ACLU when it won those landmark First Amendment victories in the 1960s, which is that speech restrictions are a bit like poison gas. So when you have the enemy in your sights and you're winning on the battlefield, sometimes it can seem a good idea to release the poison gas, but then it changes and it blows back in your face. And that I think is potentially an argument that will land with the woke left. It's all very well to erode free speech protections now. You think that's in your interest because you're
Mhm.
winning. And the only people who you're silencing will be your political opponents. And you think you're on the side of the righteous and doing God's work and on the side of history. So you think that's all fine. But what if the wind changes? Isn't there a risk that in time it'll be you that isn't able to speak, not just your political opponents? And it's odd. They kind of side with the authorities, in universities, in the police, in the criminal justice system. They're now more or less on their side, helping them silence, their political opponents. But isn't that a very dangerous, game to be playing? Isn't it dangerous to get into bed with these powerful authorities, these public authorities that have the power to silence people, in case the wind changes, which it inevitably will.
That's a very useful analogy. Um, but let's make it a little bit harder for ourselves. Do you ever worry that you're on the wrong side of history? Do you ever wonder, like, what am I wrong here? What? Why is everyone and the establishment and the woke and everyone so much against me? Why do I have to be silenced? Do you ever worry, like, I might be wrong here? History might look upon me as a very bad person in retrospect.
Mm. Yeah, no, I don't worry about that because I don't set much store by the argument that there is this thing called history, which is traveling in a particular direction, and therefore you either get on board the train or get run over. Um, uh, you know, there's no such thing really as these kind of underlying historical forces. History is what we make it. We're making history right now. Nothing's inevitable. Nothing's predestined. And arguing that certain outcomes that you think are desirable are historically inevitable, and that's why you should adjust your behavior and agree with them. It's a poor argument, and it's the kind of argument that has been made in by totalitarian political leaders, certainly in the 20th century and long before as well. It was the argument used to justify, the imprisonment, the torture, sometimes the murder of political dissidents in China and the Soviet Union in the 20th century. This idea that you're on the wrong side of history, so you're disposable. I don't think it's a kind of invoke. It's like invoking a supernatural being and claiming that supernatural being is on your side. It seems to be intellectually of a similar kind of argument. It's invoking something magical and mysterious, something we can't quite understand, but which is moving through our society, moving through our world, and we have to kind of get on board with it to be on the right side of it. I think it's just nonsense. It's just a way of trying to browbeat people, bully people into agreeing with them because they don't have any better arguments.
All right. All right. We're coming to a close, but I have two more questions. I listened to your talk with Andrew Doyle where you were discussing these matters of silencing and stuff like that. You said that the Free Speech Union and yourself advise people not to apologize when there's a public outcry for someone's canceling. Why is that?
Well, yeah, I don't want to be too categorical about that. Generally speaking, when a twitchfork mob comes for somebody because they've said something that has offended them or has supposedly endangered a vulnerable, disadvantaged group, they're kind of um, they're not likely to disperse if that person apologizes. Our experience at the Free Speech Union is that if someone apologizes as a way of trying to placate all those angry people on social media and elsewhere calling for their scalp, it doesn't make those people any less blood crazed. On the contrary, it has the opposite effect. They sense weakness and become even more frenzied and aggressive and sadistic and spiteful. Um, it's much better to push back as strongly and as robustly as you can, and go after some of the leaders of the mob, and then they often disperse. That's generally a much more effective strategy. But if someone's genuinely contrite, if they believe they've made a mistake and they regret having made that mistake, then there's nothing wrong with them apologizing. But don't do it for instrumental reasons. Don't do it because you think it's likely to make things better for you. It very rarely will.
Mm-hmm. There's one question in between that I just came to my mind. You were, I think, at Cable 2 here in Iceland in a show called Iceland Today with Snorri Másson, where you said that you were worried about journalism and that the journalists were becoming less rebellious than they were before. They were less anti-establishment and they were cozied up towards the established forces. And I think this is something that Christopher Hitchens also mentioned in his later years, that this was also something of a of something to be worried about. Can you elaborate on that thought?
Yes, I think that in the past 25 years, maybe go back a bit further, um, journalism has become a respectable, high status, pretty well paid profession. It's been admitted into the corridors of power. Journalists have. And the upshot is that there are fewer and fewer journalists who see their job as holding the powerful to account and speaking truth to power. It's not to say there aren't any, or that there aren't, there aren't pockets of good journalism, even in you know um, hyper respectable legacy publications like the New York Times and the Guardian, but they're becoming fewer and fewer, and we really saw the impact of that kind of corruption of journalism during the pandemic, in which very few mainstream publications, broadcasters challenged the wisdom of the lockdown policy and have challenged the effectiveness and safety of the vaccines. They've gone along with it. They've been co opted. They don't want to be accused of spreading misinformation or endangering people's safety. They've been persuaded that the rich and powerful are acting in the public interest, and therefore they shouldn't do too much to undermine confidence in those groups, in those authorities, because that will undermine the public interest. Um, and you can imagine, kind of, it's hard to imagine the Watergate scandal breaking now. Would Deep Throat go to a couple of journalists on the Washington Post if he had a big story to break about Biden? Well, probably not, given how the mainstream media colluded to suppress the Biden laptop story on the eve of the last US presidential election, even to the extent of the New York Post being blocked by Twitter at the behest of the FBI, because it was publicizing this particular story. These days, I imagine Deep Throat would be more likely to approach a journalist like me working for an alt media news publishing site like the Daily Skeptic, because he would know that we'd be less likely to be intimidated, pressurized
And also,
by
one more
the
thing is
establishment.
that also other media platforms would not stand with you. They would rather stand against you and tell people that they ought not to take this particular information seriously. And that is a
Yeah,
difference also that needs to be taken into account.
yes, no, absolutely. So the media now don't. It's not just that they're much less interested in challenging prevailing narratives. I mean, how many journalists for mainstream legacy publications or broadcasters challenge the kind of climate emergency narrative? Very, very few. But not only do they not see their role as doing that anymore, but as you say, they also think it's important that they should um, demonize and publicly ostracize any journalists who do challenge the prevailing narrative. There used to be a kind of respect for mavericks like Christopher Hitchens. They were thought to be, you know, a necessary part of the journalistic community. There ought to be people there aggressively challenging the authorities and prevailing narratives. Now there's very little tolerance for mavericks like that. You're kind of pushed out, publicly shamed, demonized,
Hmm. Yeah.
and by the mainstream media.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's quite an interesting time to be alive. Last question. Not everyone is a journalist. Not everyone has a platform where in which they can speak to thousands of people on a platform. How would you advise people to fight free speech in their day to day, like daily lives?
I think that I think the answer has to be a bit more courageous. To a great extent, uh, the reason, um, the people who are saying you can't say this, you can't say that, who are enforcing speech codes within organizations, companies, universities, they're a small minority, and their values are not the values of everybody. And most people, I think, are much more tolerant, much more open to being challenged, to hearing dissenting points of view. But they don't know they're in the majority, because whenever anyone speaks up and challenges the sacred values of this new kind of authoritarian class, they immediately get punished and publicly shamed. But I think if enough people stand up and speak out, then they'll discover that this emperor has no clothes, and that you know this minority is less powerful than they imagine. I'm thinking of, in the Soviet Union and in Eastern European countries with communist regimes in the late 1980s. It was partly, that gradual discovery. It began to dawn on people that very, very few people actually supported these regimes, actually believed in Marxist Leninism. Um, that the fact that the majority dissented was concealed from people by the persecution of dissidents very effectively for a long time. But eventually, when enough people stood up, whether in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in East Germany, so it dawned on people that actually they were in the overwhelming majority, that very few people were actually believed in this nonsense that was being enforced so aggressively by the authorities. And you had this kind of Berlin Wall moment. What we need in the West, in these institutions, in our public life, is a Berlin Wall moment whereby everyone, it suddenly dawns on people that actually the emperor has no clothes. The people enforcing these woke speech codes are a tiny minority. And we just have to stand up and say, we're not going to take it anymore. We're not going to do your bidding. We're going to say what we think.
Power of the powerless. All right, Toby, this has been quite the time. I really enjoyed this conversation. If you're ever in Iceland, which I think that you sometimes are, I'd love to do this sometime in person.
Sure.
Um,
Well, next
thank
time
you.
I'm in Iceland, I'll get in touch. I don't know when I'm next going to be there, but it may be in the not too distant future. I hope this free speech group really gets off the ground and establishes itself and becomes a presence in Iceland's public life. And
I hope so
I'm
too.
sure I'll be back to talk to the group again.
Looking forward to it. All right, Toby, thank you so much for coming. Until next time.
Thank you.